and now we have plenty of time for Q&A, and we've definitely had some questions coming in. So if all of the speakers from this session, if you're comfortable with it, no pressure, turn on your video, and I have a series of questions for you guys. So I'll send the first one to Jake Bleacher. This is a twofer. We had two kind of comparable questions. So can Starship dock with Gateway? If not, how do astronauts get to the lunar surface from Gateway? And does the selection of Starship have implications for the future of Gateway and Orion? And how does Starship fit in that whole picture?
Okay, some good questions there. So Kelsey, can you hear me all right?
Loud and clear, yep.
Awesome. Yeah, so those are good questions to kind of help us scope, making sure that we're communicating clearly what's going on. And the first thing I want to say is that we remain in blackout for discussing the option A results. So I can't go into detail about what capabilities exist within option A. But I do want to remind everyone about a point that I mentioned in my presentation, which is that option A is a contract for 2 test landings. One of those is uncrewed, and then one is crewed. So this shows kind of our iterative approach to enabling capability and exploration on the surface. But we expect to have a subsequent call for contracts to enable future landings beyond those first 2 test landings. So the infrastructure and functionality that Gateway provides are critical, as you've kind of heard from multiple presentations, are critical for our long-term operations in deep space, including the moon. So that's across the SMD spectrum of science interests, across the spectrum of what we're looking to do on the HEO side. So I just want to emphasize that our long-term strategy includes Gateway, docking for basically the future HLS sustained procurement. So this next announcement after those first 2 landings. And actually, I'm pretty sure we just released an RFI for services beyond the option A, I think just yesterday. So I'm going to work with our folks and make sure to find the link for that if it's out, and we'll get that posted in the chat room or on the chat thread so that we can look at that. Just a note about that, the RFI, request for information, is open to all of U.S. industry, but it's the starting point for the discussion about what these repeat landings look like after this option A. So would expect that there will be a call for proposals that comes out down the road after that. So yeah, those are good questions. Again, sorry we're still in blackout on discussing the specific capabilities on option A, but just a reminder that option A is specific to those first 2 test landings, and that we'll have a call for those future landings after that.
Thanks, Jake. I'll shoot the next question to Rachel. What is the plan to sync science objectives to inform exploration ISRU needs to extend stays to then broaden science studies?
Oh boy, that's a that's a tough one. So as far as the LSIG side, right, we are on the kind of planning out the technology needed to start establishing this infrastructure. I think a lot of what we're going to be looking at, and we probably would want to work with League for, since they have a much stronger hand on the science side, is how we can build the infrastructure to address some of the long-term science questions and do things like sorties around the rest of the moon from this infrastructure and whatnot. So it would be, I think, a lot of joint road mapping. What we've been working with, so we're working within these focus areas, but trying to reconcile it with the work that League has already done as far as the larger exploration roadmap, and trying to see where we can fill in the pieces on the early side of getting to this ISRU and getting to having a plant to test the extraction and then to build on it from there. So I guess it's, yeah, not sure that answered the question, but.
No, that's great insight. Since you gave some League shout outs, Amy, anything to add there?
Only to add that, we want to be working together, and that's why, Jose is working with LSIC. So we are on each other's radars, and we are in communication to make sure that we are helping each other and not double dipping and not working in parallel.
Right. And just to be clear, you know, we're focusing on like the technical elements to get there. So the science reasoning and connecting the technologists with all the science knowledge that's out there. But as far as the kind of motivation and plan, we're staying out of that business on our side.
Thanks, Rachel. And Amy?
Except that I like to talk about it because of science. Sorry. I'm going to mute myself while you ask another question.
Amy, while you have the con, how do your efforts through League help the commercial sector participate? So talk about maybe a little bit more about the role of the CAB.
Oh, good question. So I believe that there is going to be a component, for example, at the annual meeting in the fall for the CAB. And the Commercial Advisory Board is also working to have more regular meetings amongst themselves. So if there are people who are interested in what the CAB is doing, I can drop Elizabeth's email in the chat box if anybody wants to get in touch with her about how to get involved with the Commercial Advisory Board.
Thanks.
So I'll type that now.
Okay, I think this is best for Steve. How is HRP addressing health concerns associated with lunar regolith and dust, and where do possible collaborations exist with geologic studies of the moon? And Greg also mentioned this, so we'll go to Steve and then Greg if you have anything.
Okay, hey, this is Steve. Actually, that is not one of the areas of research that we've been pursuing recently. Until we can get samples from the Martian surface, we're not going to pursue research for that. For lunar, we've done a fair amount of research in the past. Now, if there are other partnerships or collaborations we can develop, we'd be happy to participate. We have a team of toxicologists who have worked on that. I think the one thing that we still have a little bit of work on is looking at oxidative stress potentially and lunar dust and how that might interact and affect the human. But as of right now, we don't have much active research in that field.
Thanks. Greg, you mentioned it a little bit as well, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I had an audio dropout at a critical point. What was the question again?
The link between lunar dust and regolith and health concerns associated with dust and regolith to geologic studies of the moon.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, Tim Glotch's team is doing the health studies and whatnot. And I'm not sure if the question is taking a look at different kinds of regolith that might be experienced at different locations. But if so, I know that that's something that that team is very definitely addressing, both in increasing the fidelity of the simulants that are used, as well as looking at a variety of different kinds of simulants.
Thanks, appreciate it. Another question for Jake. Why won't the LTV be ready before the first Artemis crewed landing? A lot of the community documents we've heard talked about today, including the SDT report, highlight the importance of the LTV. So can you talk a little bit more about timing and expectations?
Yeah, certainly. So the sequence of when we put the capabilities down is certainly dependent on the budgetary constraints. And Kathy mentioned that in the very beginning today. I mean, we'd all love to have all the capability at the beginning, but you have to build your capability up. And I think this builds off the prior question, reminding that the first two landings are kind of our test landings as we are really testing out the entire system. We want to make sure that LTV is in place where we will be doing the repeat landings down the road on the next contract that I mentioned. And so it doesn't mean that that's not where these test landings are going. We just don't know that yet. The LTV is something we certainly know based on the objectives and requirements is the kind of thing that we want to have there. We want to have that increased mobility. We want to have something like that in place early before we can put in place something like a pressurized rover. So again, it kind of goes to budgetary constraints and making sure that we kind of continue to build our capability as we move along. What we wouldn't want to do is delay a first crewed test landing in order to try and have an LTV in place. We want to go ahead and keep checking those boxes like I showed with the SLS chart. We got to get those green checks in and test out all the systems so that we're ready to be fully operational with the capabilities as they come online.
Thanks. Very illuminating. A question for Azita. How does the NESC decide what areas to study? Are they requested by the mission directorates, or do you decide kind of which topics you want to cover independently?
Almost all the time, the requests come from mission directorate programs and projects. Mostly, as I mentioned, human exploration and operation directorate, 70% of the requests come from there that we take. And the 30% or so are in support of actually science mission directorate projects that we support.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Over to Renee. How are the recommendations that you mentioned from the recent SDT report being implemented across the agency and Artemis?
Yeah, so I would say we're making pretty good progress on some of them, specifically the ones I mentioned. My presentation, we're focused on looking at cryogenic sample return, looking at some of the sort of Artemis architectural elements, which are still sort of on pause until HLS selection is finalized. And then also on the science implementation strategy with a lot of the internal utilization coordination groups, which many of the people on this call are members of and contributing to, and which pull from all of the documents that I mentioned earlier and that have been presented by other folks on this panel. So there's a lot of, I would say, data gathering right now, putting together surface objectives for the missions that pull from these strategic documents and trying to just put together, a comprehensive list of capabilities that are going to be used to enable the Artemis, science specifically with the Artemis program more broadly. So there has been a lot of progress made, and I'm sure you can relate, Kelsey, to the volume of requests that we get to provide input to these types of groups. So it's been overall really positive. Lots of opportunities to provide input.
Thanks. I think it's a testament to how to the utility and implementation of that document, how many times we've heard about it today and how many talks have about that. So
I've gotten a lot of mileage out of that one chart deck.
See, if I could just add to that,
Sure.
Julie Robinson gave a talk earlier about our utilization coordination integration group, and the SDT is basically incorporated right into the efforts on that group. I mean, that's a guiding document that we're looking at to say, okay, these are the things we need to try to accomplish, and that helps highlight places where, as Renee mentioned, where maybe we don't have a capability in place that enables us to do an objective. So we're studying to see what do we need to bring that capability online, comparing that with what do we have the capabilities in place to do right away. And we can start getting those objectives agreed upon by the directorates through that USIG group. So I would say that SDT has gone straight into the process of trying to reach the multi-directorate agreement on objectives for these Artemis missions.
Thanks, Jake and Renee. Kind of coming on the heels of that, a question for Greg. So we've heard about the SDT report, and we've heard about a number of these sort of cross-directorate groups that are, really trying to represent science and utilization across Artemis. Those include the Federated Board, in acronym spaghetti like the USIG and the SNTU group, which is the Utilization Coordination and Integration Group, and the Science and Technology Utilization Group. So these are all efforts that are trying to tackle science and utilization, which of course is a core, guiding principle of SURVEY. So how are you and SURVEY interacting with all of these groups or not? Can you speak a little bit to the efforts of the SURVEY funded teams in SURVEY Central as they touch these science and utilization efforts?
Yeah, you bet. That's an excellent question. And we are working with nearly all of those groups, the USIG, LSIC, I'm on Rachel's executive board and all that. And so and it's really, I want to kind of give a broad perspective here. It's a very gratifying time because NASA is actually working together on this, this shouldn't be taken lightly. I've been with NASA for many decades, and this hasn't always been the case, but the directorates are working together, the groups are working together, and we and Survey leadership, Christina and I, are making sure that the PIs are aware of this work, our PIs, I should say, and contributing where they can. And I think Jake and others would attest that they definitely have. So it's a great time. I think this is being managed rather well.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate that. And a little programming note, we have permission from our amazing Survey support to run a few minutes into the break. So we have a few more questions, so we'll keep pressing with that. But on that theme, Rachel, any insights from LSEC about this type of sort of broad science utilization support, and any kind of insights you want to share from how things have been going over with LSEC?
Sorry, can you repeat that again? About what kind of support?
Just the sort of broad science and utilization support that we've been hearing about today, and all of the sort of cross-directorate bodies that sort of touch science and utilization. We heard LSEC mentioned in a lot of those presentations, so clearly
Right.
you guys are heavily integrated, but just wanted to give you a chance to talk to that integration if you'd like to.
Yeah, I think so. I think on our side with the utilization aspect of it, our big role is to assist in recommendations towards what kind of. So you're talking about like resource utilization side of things?
Any of your focus areas.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, what's really special to me about STMD's efforts with LSIC is that they see great value in reaching out to the community and having this back and forth. So it's sort of like we're a pipeline to them, as well as with the communication that's going on within NASA. Our first big demos with STMD are going to be things like some of the ISRU capabilities and the power capabilities, because we really want to focus on the key infrastructure elements that will enable not just the work that NASA wants to do, but set the stage for a future sustained presence that transitions to other players. So, in my mind, I imagine something like Antarctica, where we can have this ongoing research. It may be a science wonderland that is further in the future than we'd all like it to be, but that we can get this cooperation in and build the infrastructure to then hand off to others that can really make use of the lunar surface. So that's kind of like our end goal game. But to prove out some of these, build up the infrastructure, invest in the technologies, and really work with the commercial community so that they understand that NASA is investing in them to be able to provide these services, and not just that NASA is going to do some stuff and then go away. The reason things are being worked through public-private partnerships is that, this investment, and it feeds back into a sustainable economy when the companies still own that IP and own those services, and then sell back, that NASA becomes a customer of the power of the resources to continue with their sustained presence. So that's kind of our piece in that, is to work on the infrastructure elements that will make the long-term goals possible.
Thanks.
And hopefully Science Wonderland.
Okay, one last question for Steve. Can you talk a little bit about how the duration of Artemis crewed missions is important for your science?
Sure. Because of our focus on Mars and that duration being way outside the box, duration will be quite important for us. That's not to say that shorter duration Artemis missions won't be, because we'll be tapping into other hazards besides just microgravity, right? So I talked about the 5 hazards, and in low Earth orbit, microgravity is sort of like the big dominant one. But once we are in Artemis, it's going to be more evenly distributed. In fact, radiation will probably move more towards the top. So we'll be getting radiation information even from the shorter duration Artemis missions than we've gotten from low Earth orbit. And then as they get longer, it will be even more relevant to Mars. So the longer we can be there, the better. Once we get to something like a shakedown mission that's close to a Mars mission, that's when we'll really be able to dial in on that Martian information that we're trying to get to. So for us, for HRP, always the longer the better, which is why we're trying to do one-year missions on the space station. But everything will give us information because the elevation of those other 4 hazards that we don't see as much of with ISS.
Thanks. Appreciate that. Longer is better.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna head to a break now. Thanks for being willing to eat into that break a little bit. I think this was a great discussion. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers again. Really appreciate it. And thanks to Deborah again for driving slides for this session. So we'll re-adjourn at 4:05 Eastern, 1:05 Pacific for the last session. Thanks, everybody.